There is a particular cruelty in the passage of time that a confined man experiences that free people do not fully comprehend, because free people experience time as a current they move through, shaped by it but also shaping it, their choices and their presence making the days what they are. A man in a cell experiences time differently. He experiences it as something that moves without him, that carries everything he has ever built, and everyone he has ever loved forward into a future he cannot reach and cannot influence, and can only imagine in the long hours of the confined day. And the imagining is both the only comfort available and the most precise form of torture that confinement produces, because the imagination of the life proceeding without him is rarely accurate and is almost always more merciful than the reality. The man he was before the cell remains in the imagination intact. The life he left remains in the imagination waiting. The people he loved remain in the imagination as he left them, in the positions he left them in, holding the spaces he occupied with the faithful patience of people who understand that he is coming back and who are keeping everything ready for the return. The imagination is almost never right. His name was Edward Marsh. He was born in the town of Millhaven, Massachusetts Bay Colony, in the year 1701, the son of a carpenter who had come to the colony from England a generation before, and who had built, in the specific way of practical men in practical trades who are willing to work harder than those around them, a modest but genuine prosperity from the colony's endless appetite for well-made wooden things. Edward grew up in his father's trade and developed, alongside the carpenter's knowledge that his father gave him, a commercial intelligence that his father had not possessed, but that Edward possessed from early adolescence as a kind of native fluency, an ability to read the market and the people in it, and to understand, with a precision that was not taught but simply present, where the opportunity lay and how to reach it. He had opened his own merchant shop in Millhaven in 1722, at the age of 21, with the savings from 4 years of skilled carpentry work and a trading license obtained from the Colonial administration after the specific process of application that the colony required. The shop dealt in the dry goods and hardware that the growing town of Millhaven required in quantities that the existing merchants were not always reliably supplying, and Edward had understood this gap with the commercial clarity he brought to all such assessments, and had positioned himself to fill it with a quality and a consistency that built, in the first 2 years of the operation, a customer base that the established merchants found more threatening than they had expected from a 21-year-old carpenter's son. He married in 1723. Her name was Anne Good, the daughter of a Millhaven farmer whose land was on the eastern edge of the town, a woman of 20 with the specific combination of warmth and practicality that Edward valued in all things, the warmth that made her presence in any room a genuine pleasure, and the practicality that made her the kind of partner a man building something real needed in the specific, daily, unglamorous work of building it. She came into the marriage with a modest dowry and a genuine love for Edward, and the full intention of being everything a wife could be to a man she had chosen with her eyes open. And the first 3 years of the marriage were the years of building that Edward had always intended them to be. The shop growing and the household growing, and the sense of a life properly on its way producing in both of them the specific satisfaction that comes from watching something you are making become what you intended it to become. His best friend was a man named George Aldies. George had come to Millhaven in 1720, 2 years before Edward opened the shop, from a town in Connecticut whose name he mentioned occasionally, and whose specific details he never elaborated on in the way of a man who has left something behind and prefers not to return to it even in conversation. He was 26 when he arrived in Millhaven, 3 years older than Edward, and he had a manner that made people like him before they had examined whether liking him was warranted, the specific manner of a man who is genuinely good company and who has learned, through whatever the Connecticut years contained, the specific value of being good company as a social and commercial asset. He was warm and entertaining and attentive to the people around him in a way that produced, in the people he was attentive to, the feeling of being valued, which is one of the most powerful feelings a person can provide, and one of the most difficult to resist building a trust on. Edward had met him at the tavern on Millhaven's Main Street in the autumn of 1720, and had found, in the conversation that extended across an evening, the specific pleasure of talking to someone who understood both the practical world of commerce and the specific world of Millhaven's social geography in ways that complemented his own understanding. They had become friends in the way that friendships form when two people of compatible intelligence find each other in a place where such compatibility is not common, which is to say quickly, and with a depth that the speed of the formation did not diminish. By the time Edward opened the shop in 1722, George Aldi's was his most trusted friend in Millhaven and the person with whom he shared, more than any other, the thinking and the planning and the specific interior conversation of a man who is building something and who needs a particular kind of listener. George had a small trading operation of his own, import and export at a modest scale, buying goods in Boston and selling them through contacts in the smaller Connecticut and Massachusetts towns, and the operation overlapped with Edward's shop in ways that were complementary rather than competitive. George providing certain goods that Edward sold and Edward providing a retail operation that gave George's imported goods a reliable outlet. It was a practical partnership as well as a personal friendship, and it worked in both registers with the smooth efficiency of an arrangement between two people who understand each other's capabilities and who are each genuinely useful to the other. And like George, this needs to be said clearly, and without the retrospective judgment that comes from knowing what eventually happened, because at the time it was simply a fact of the friendship, the natural warmth of a woman who likes her husband's closest friend, and who includes him in the life of the household, in the way that close friends are included, with the domestic familiarity of someone who is present often enough to be, in some sense, part of the household's regular rhythm. George ate at their table twice a week. He was present at the birth of their first child, a son named Thomas, in 1724. He was the first person Edward told when Anne became pregnant with their second child in 1725. The debt that destroyed Edward's life was not his fault. It is important to establish this from the beginning, because the colonial legal system that addressed it did not distinguish between fault and responsibility in the way that a more sophisticated system might have, and the absence of that distinction was the mechanism through which everything that followed became possible. Edward had extended credit to a merchant in Boston in the spring of 1725, a man named Hargreave, who had been a reliable commercial partner for 2 years, and whose creditworthiness Edward had assessed with the same careful attention he gave to all commercial assessments. Hargreave had received goods on credit to the amount of £230 sterling, which was a significant sum, but not beyond the boundaries of what their established relationship could reasonably support. Hargreave died in July of 1725. He died without a will and without heirs, and with debts that substantially exceeded the value of his estate, and the colonial legal process that addressed his insolvent estate distributed its limited assets among his creditors at pennies on the pound, producing for Edward a recovery of £11 from the 230 he had extended. The remaining £219 represented a loss that Edward's operation could not immediately absorb, not because the operation was weak, it was strong, but because the credit he had extended to Hargreave had itself been funded partly through a credit instrument that was now called due by the Boston merchant who had provided it, and who was not sympathetic to the argument that the loss was not Edward's fault, because the law of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1725 was not sympathetic to that argument either. The debt instrument was called at its full value in September of 1725. Edward could not pay it immediately. He could pay a portion of it immediately, and the remainder within a year if the operation was given time to recover, and he said so to the creditor, and proposed a payment schedule that he believed was reasonable and achievable. The The creditor did not find it reasonable. The creditor filed for judgment, and the Colonial Court issued the judgment, and the judgment was enforced in the specific way that the Massachusetts Bay Colony's debt law enforced unpaid commercial judgments in 1725, which was through the confinement of the debtor in the debtor's prison until the debt was satisfied, or until an arrangement for its satisfaction was reached. Edward Marsh was confined to the Millhaven debtor's prison in November of 1725, at the age of 24, leaving behind a wife who was 7 months pregnant with their second child, a 1-year-old son, and a merchant shop that was the foundation of everything he had built and everything he intended to build, in the hands of the man he trusted most to manage it until he could return. He left it in George Aldee's hands. This was the decision that the rest of this story is built upon, and it was, at the moment of making it, the only sensible decision available. George was his closest friend and his commercial partner, and the person in Millhaven who understood the operation best, and who had the commercial capability to manage it during Edward's confinement. George agreed immediately, with the warmth and the decisiveness of a man who understands what a friend needs and who provides it without requiring to be asked twice. And Edward went into the prison in November of 1725, with the understanding that George would manage the shop, maintain the household, see Anne through the birth of the second child, and work toward the satisfaction of the debt that would end the confinement. Anne gave birth in January of 1726 to a daughter they had already decided to name Mary. George was present, as he had been present at Thomas's birth, and he managed the practical arrangements of the birth with the competent attentiveness he brought to everything he managed. Edward received the news of Mary's birth through the prison's message system 3 days after the event, a delayed and impersonal form of receiving the arrival of his own daughter, and he held the news in the cold of the cell and felt the full weight of the distance between where he was and where he should have been, which was everywhere except where he was. The first year of the confinement was managed on the understanding that it would end within the year. Edward had been working, through the limited channels available to a confined man, on the satisfaction of the debt, on the negotiation of a payment arrangement that would secure his release, and George had been working from outside on the same problem, managing the shop's income and directing what he could toward the debt's reduction. The first year produced partial progress, sufficient to demonstrate good faith but not sufficient to satisfy the judgment. And the creditor, who was a man of commercial principle rather than personal cruelty, but who distinguished between these two qualities less carefully than the distinction deserved, declined to release Edward on partial payment. The second year was harder, not because the imprisonment's physical conditions changed significantly, but because the understanding that the confinement was going to extend beyond the first year changed the quality of everything it contained, changed it from a temporary interruption into something with a duration that could not be clearly defined. And the absence of a clear ending is the thing that makes confinement most difficult, more difficult than the physical circumstances themselves, because the mind requires a horizon to navigate by, and a horizon that cannot be located is a specific form of suffering that has no adequate description. George visited in the second year less frequently than the first. Edward noted this without immediately attaching significance to it, attributing it to the demands of managing the shop and the household, which were real demands and which George had taken on at significant cost to his own operation. He wrote to Anne, and Anne wrote back with the constrained warmth of letters written by a woman who is managing a difficult situation, and who is careful about what she says in correspondence that passes through the prison's official channels before it reaches its recipient. He wrote to George, and George wrote back with the practical efficiency of a man reporting on commercial matters, the shop's accounts, the debt reduction, the household's condition. It was in the second year that Edward began to notice, in George's letters, a quality that he could not immediately name, a slight shift in register, in the way the letters addressed the shop and the household and Anne, a subtle but specific movement from the language of a man who is managing something on behalf of someone else toward the language of a man who is managing something that is, in some increasing sense, his own. He noticed it in the way that people notice things they do not want to notice, which is partially, and with the specific resistance of someone who understands that noticing fully is going to require something of him that he is not yet ready to require. He noticed it fully in the spring of 1727, when George's letter describing the renewal of the shop's trading license used the phrase "my license" in a context where our license or Edward's license would have been the accurate construction, and the "my" landed in Edward's reading of the letter with the specific weight of a small word in the wrong place that reorganizes the meaning of everything around it. He wrote to Anne directly, outside the regular correspondence, through a fellow prisoner who had an arrangement with a sympathetic guard and who passed messages for the price of a portion of whatever food was available that day. He wrote asking her, plainly and without accusation because he was not yet certain enough to accuse, whether there was anything in the management of the shop or the household that he should know about that was not being communicated through the official letters. Anne's reply came through the same channel 3 days later, and it was the most difficult letter Edward had ever read, not because it was harsh or unkind, but because it was honest in the way of a woman who has been carrying something for 18 months and who has, at the moment of being directly asked, decided that the carrying alone is over. She said that George had been managing the shop with a competence that had surprised even her by its extent, that he had grown the operation in ways that exceeded what it had been when Edward was confined, that the shop was prospering under his management, and that this prosperity had produced, in the minds of Millhaven's commercial community, a gradual but definitive association of the shop with George rather than with its absent owner. She said that George's name had appeared on the shop's trading documentation in a capacity that she had not fully understood at first, but that she now understood as something more than a manager's designation. She said that she had tried to question this, and that George had explained it in terms she had accepted, because she had not known how not to accept them, and because she had been alone with 2 small children for 18 months and George had been the person managing the practical world around her, and she had not had the knowledge or the position to challenge what he was doing with it. She said she was sorry. She said it in the specific way of a woman who is apologizing for something that was done to her as much as by her, and the apology tore something in Edward that did not fully heal for a very long time. He spent the 3rd year of his confinement in the specific, focused state of a man who has understood the full extent of what is happening outside his walls and who is working, with every tool available to him, to address it before the addressing becomes impossible. He wrote to the Colonial Court. He wrote to the debt's creditor. He wrote to members of Millhaven's community who had been his customers and his neighbors, and who, he believed, would understand the situation if it was explained to them. He wrote to George, directly and without the courtesy of indirection, and said what he knew and asked for the explanation that he believed George owed him. George's reply was the most revealing document of the entire period. Not because it was confessional, it was not. George was not a man who confessed in the way that Nathan Calloway had eventually confessed. He was a man who managed, and his reply to Edward's direct letter was a managed response, acknowledging the concerns Edward had raised, providing explanations that were technically plausible, and doing all of this with the warmth and the apparent sincerity of a man who is genuinely sorry that a misunderstanding has caused his friend distress, while not conceding a single substantive point or offering to restore a single thing that had been moved from Edward's column to his own. The letter read like a response from a man who cared deeply about Edward and was doing everything possible for him, and it was, in its careful construction, one of the most dishonest things Edward had ever read, and he had known George long enough to know the difference between the warmth that was real and the warmth that was performed, and the warmth in this letter was entirely the second kind. He filed a formal complaint with the Colonial Court in the spring of 1728, the 3rd year of his confinement, challenging the appropriation of the shop's trading license and the management arrangements that George had put in place. The court reviewed the complaint with the specific limitations of a colonial court system that was not well equipped for the complexity of what Edward was describing, which was a gradual, subtle commercial appropriation conducted by a person who had been given legal access to the operation during the owner's confinement, and who had used that access to position himself as the operation's principal in ways that were individually defensible and collectively devastating. The court found that the trading license, which had been renewed in George's name, required examination. It found that the examination required Edward's presence at a hearing. It issued a conditional release order, releasing Edward from the debtor's prison for the purpose of attending the hearing, on the condition that he remain in Millhaven and that the debt's original judgment remain in force. He was released in October of 1728, 7 years and 1 month after he had entered the prison, not because the debt was satisfied, because a legal process required his presence outside. He walked out of the Millhaven debtor's prison on an October morning in 1728 and stood on the street outside and felt the specific quality of a man returning to the surface from a depth he has been in long enough that the surface has changed. The street was the same street. The buildings were the same buildings. The air smelled of the same Massachusetts autumn that he had known his entire life, the specific smell of turning leaves and wood smoke, and the particular quality of October light in colonial New England that is unlike October light anywhere else he had ever been. All of it was the same, and all of it was different in the way that things are different when the person perceiving them has been away for 7 years and has come back to find that the 7 years have not waited for them. He walked to the shop first. He walked to it because it was the direction his feet had always taken from that street, and because he needed to see it before he saw anything else. The shop was on the north side of the main street between the Chandler and the Cooperage, and he had built it with his own hands in 1722, and had painted the sign himself, Marsh's Merchant Goods, in the careful lettering of a man who understood that a sign was a commitment, and who had made it with the intention of keeping it for the rest of his working life. The sign above the door did not say Marsh's Merchant Goods. It said Aldi's and Company, General Merchants. It was a good sign, well painted in professional lettering, and the shop beneath it was, through the window, a well-stocked and well-maintained operation that had clearly prospered across the 7 years of his absence. He stood in front of it on the October morning and read the sign, and then read it again, and then stood with it for a long moment in the way that a person stands with something that has confirmed what they already knew, but that is nonetheless, in the confirming, harder than the knowing. He went to the house. The house was on the western side of the town, a house he had built with his own hands in the years before the shop, a house he had brought Anne into as a bride in 1723, and that had been the household of the Marsh family across the years of building and the year of Thomas's birth and the beginning of Mary's life. He walked to it in the October morning and knocked on the door of the house he had built, because it was no longer simply his to enter, and the door was opened by a woman he recognized as his wife, and who was looking at him with the expression of a woman who has been expecting this moment, and who has not known, in all the months of expecting it, what to say when it arrived. She said his name, Edward. She said it in the way that people say the names of people they have lost and found again, with the specific quality of something that has been stored in a place it could not be used, and that is now being brought out into the air after a long time in the dark. He came inside. He sat in the chair that had been his chair, and looked at the house that had been his house, and felt the full complex weight of everything that was familiar and everything that was different. And the differences were numerous in ways that told a story without requiring words to tell it. The furniture was not different. The house itself was not different. What was different was subtler than furniture, was in the arrangement of daily life, in the way the room had been lived in by people who had settled into a rhythm that did not include him, a rhythm that was complete in his absence rather than incomplete and waiting. Anne sat across from him, and they talked for 2 hours. The conversation of a man who has been away for 7 years and a woman who has been alone for 7 years, finding the specific geography of what remains between them after the 7 years have done what 7 years do. She told him what she had not been able to say in letters. She told him about George's management of the shop in the first year and the second year, and the way the management had become, gradually, and in ways she had not always understood as they were happening, a replacement rather than a stewardship. She told him about the license renewal and the company designation, and the commercial relationships that George had built in Edward's name, and then transferred to his own, piece by piece, with the specific patience of a man who understood that the accumulation of many small movements produces a large displacement that is harder to challenge than a single large one. She told him, with the specific difficulty of a woman who has been carrying this for the longest, and who understands that the telling is going to cost them both something that they may not be able to recover, that George had proposed to her in the 5th year of Edward's confinement. She said she had refused. She said it clearly and directly, and looked at him with the eyes of a woman who needs him to believe her. And he believed her because he knew her well enough to know the difference between the truth and everything else. She said she had refused, and that George had not pressed the refusal, but that something had changed between them after it. A quality in George's attention to the household that had become subtly less attentive, and that she had understood from the change that the attentiveness had contained a calculation that her refusal had unsettled. She said she had written to Edward after the proposal and the refusal, and he said he had never received the letter, and she said she had suspected as much, and had not written again on that subject, because she had not known what writing again would cost. He went to see George the following morning. He went to the shop that bore George's name on its sign, and he went in the morning before the trading day began, and he found George in the back office with the accounts, and he sat across from him at the desk that had been Edward's desk, and he said what he had come to say. George received it with the composure of a man who has been managing this situation for 3 years, and who has prepared for this conversation with the thoroughness he brought to all preparations. He expressed warmth at seeing Edward. He expressed sorrow about the circumstances. He expressed a willingness to review everything that had been done in Edward's absence, and to ensure that Edward was fully informed of all of it, and that any arrangements that required adjustment would be adjusted. He said all of this with the specific performance of concern and friendship that he had always performed, and that Edward had, until the 3rd year of the confinement, not understood to be primarily a performance. Edward looked at him across the desk, and felt the full and complete understanding of who George Aldiss was and what George Aldiss had done. And he said that he appreciated the warmth and the willingness to review, and that what he actually required was the restoration of his trading license and the return of the commercial relationships and the documented acknowledgement of what had been done with them across 7 years, and the accounting for the shop's income across those 7 years in terms that reflected the reality of who had owned the shop and who had managed it as that owner's agent. He said he had the hearing in 2 weeks, and that he intended to present this position to the court, and that he was giving George the opportunity to address it between them before it was addressed in the official proceeding. George said he would need time to consult with his lawyer. Edward said he understood. He spent the 2 weeks between the conversation with George and the court hearing in the preparation of his position, working with the same focused competence he had brought to everything he built, gathering the documents he could access and the testimony of the people in Millhaven who had known him before the confinement, and who could speak to the nature of the relationship between him and the shop and the nature of George's role in it. He found 3 people willing to give formal testimony, and he found, in the Colonial Court's own records, a series of documents relating to the trading license renewal that contained inconsistencies between what George had told the court at the time of the renewal and what the underlying records showed about the ownership structure of the operation. The court hearing in November of 1728 was not a simple proceeding, and it did not produce a simple outcome. Colonial courts in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1728 were not courts of great sophistication in commercial matters, and they were not courts that had, in general, been designed to address the specific kind of commercial appropriation that Edward was describing. What they could do, and what this court did, was find that the trading license renewal had been conducted in terms that did not accurately reflect the ownership situation of the underlying business, and that required correction. The correction took 6 months to work through the administrative process. During those 6 months, Edward was technically free, the conditional release still in force, and he used the freedom to rebuild what he could rebuild while the legal process addressed what it could address. He had the house, which was in his name and had remained in his name across the confinement, because Anne had not permitted any arrangement that would have changed this regardless of the pressure that had been applied to permit it. He had Anne and he had Thomas, who was 4 years old, and Mary, who had been born into his confinement, and who he was meeting for the first time as a walking, speaking child of 2 who looked at the man her mother said was her father with the open and unencumbered curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to distrust strangers. He had the specific quality of a man who has survived 7 years of confinement without losing the things that confinement most attacks, which are the clarity of purpose and the willingness to continue. And these were, when the inventory of what remained was honestly taken, more than nothing and sufficient for a beginning. The court's final order, issued in May of 1729, restored the trading license to Edward's name, and found that the commercial appropriation had been conducted in breach of the management agreement that had been understood to exist at the time of Edward's confinement. It ordered a financial accounting of the shop's income across the 7 years, and the payment to Edward of a portion of that income, representing his ownership interest during the period of George's management. The portion was not the full amount that an accurate accounting would have produced. It was a negotiated figure, lower than what Edward had sought and higher than what George had initially offered, arrived at through the specific compression of a legal proceeding that wants a resolution, and that finds the resolution in the space between the competing positions rather than in the full truth of either. George Aldies left Millhaven in the summer of 1729, 3 months after the court's order. He left without announcement and without ceremony, in the specific way of a man who understands that the place he has been in has become untenable and who has the specific capability to establish himself somewhere new. He went, as far as the records show, to Connecticut, which was where he had come from, and Millhaven never heard from him again in any form that the town's collective memory has preserved. Edward rebuilt the shop. He rebuilt it in the way he had built it the first time, with the focused competence of a man who knows what he is doing, and who does not allow the difficulty of the circumstances to affect the quality of the work. He had the restored license and the settlement money and the shop's customer base, which was diminished but not destroyed because the customers who had been his before the confinement remembered him and returned when he returned, in the specific loyalty of people who had always dealt with him honestly, and who found the honesty a reason to come back. By 1733, he had rebuilt the operation to approximately what it had been in 1725, which was not what it could have been if the 7 years had not happened, but which was real and his, and built with clear hands on a foundation that no one else had touched. And stayed. This is the thing that the story of Edward Marsh most requires to be said clearly, and without the ambiguity that sentiment sometimes introduces into such statements. Anne stayed not because she had no alternatives, and not because she was required to by the law or the custom of the colony, which would have allowed her to petition for abandonment on the grounds of the extended absence, and would have received such a petition with some sympathy from a court that understood the 7 years had been involuntary. She stayed because she had chosen Edward with her eyes open in 1723, and because the choosing, in her understanding of it, was not conditional on circumstances, and was not subject to revision, because the circumstances had become what they had become. She stayed because she was the kind of person who honors what she has chosen, and because the honoring of it was, in the end, the most important thing she had to offer, and she was not willing to withdraw it. What was between them was not unchanged by the 7 years. It could not be unchanged by 7 years, by the specific geography of a marriage in which one person was confined, and the other was managing everything alone, and in which the managing had produced a self-sufficiency that the marriage's original structure had not contained, and that did not simply dissolve when the confinement ended. What was between them was changed in the specific ways that things are changed when they are tested very hard for a very long time, which is not diminishment but a different quality, the quality of something that has been worked rather than merely used, that has been through its hardest test, and that has, in the going through, become something more specific and more durable than it was before the test. They had 2 more children after Edward's return, a son named William in 1731 and a daughter named Grace in 1733. The household of the Marsh family in Millhaven, Massachusetts, in the 1730s and 1740s, was the household of people who understood what they had and who understood it with the specific completeness that comes from having nearly not had it. Edward managed the shop with the competence of someone who has built something twice and who has no intention of losing it a third time. Anne managed the household with the practical intelligence that had always been hers, and that the 7 years had expanded rather than reduced. Thomas grew up understanding the full story of his father's imprisonment and what had been done during it. He understood it not as a story of victimhood, but as a story of a man who had survived the worst thing that the specific combination of misfortune and human betrayal could produce, and who had rebuilt from it with sufficient clarity and sufficient competence that the rebuilding was genuine, not a reduced version of what had been before but a different and in some respects stronger thing, built the second time with the knowledge of what the first building had cost and what it had taught. He told it to his own children and they told it to theirs. And the story of Edward Marsh moved through the Marsh family across the generations as the family moved through the decades. The specific account of a man who had been taken from everything he built by the combination of an unjust debt law and a trusted friend's betrayal, and who had come back from 7 years of that and had built again, not because the building was easy, or because the betrayal was forgotten, or because the 7 years had not cost him things he could not recover, but because building was what he was, and the being of what you are is not something that confinement or betrayal can permanently remove, not if the person who is it is willing to be it again, when the conditions for being it return. The conditions returned. Edward made them return, with the focused competence he had always brought to such things, and the returning of them was not a triumph in the loud sense of that word, but a triumph in the deeper and more durable sense, the sense in which a person who has been reduced to almost nothing and who has built again from that almost nothing has demonstrated something about themselves that nothing external can subsequently challenge. George Aldi's is not in the historical record of Millhaven after 1729. His departure is noted in the town's informal records, in the way that departures of significant figures are noted, and his absence from the community is marked by its effects rather than by any formal acknowledgement. The shop that bore his name for 7 years bore Edward's name again by 1730 and bore it until Edward's death in 1762 at the age of 61, and bore it after that in the name of Thomas Marsh, who had grown up watching his father rebuild something from the ruins of what another man had made of it, and who understood from the watching both what the building cost and why it was worth the cost. Edward Marsh was buried in the Millhaven churchyard in 1762 beside his parents, and in the company of the community he had been born into, and that had watched him go into a prison in 1725 and come out of it in 1728, and rebuild what he had built the first time with the same hands and the same mind, and the same fundamental quality of a man who did not, under any circumstances, except that what had been done to him was the final word on what his life was going to be. The final word on what his life was going to be was spoken not by the debt or by the confinement or by George Aldi's 7 years of careful appropriation, but by Edward himself, in the accumulation of the days of rebuilding, in the shop's restored sign, and the restored license, and the customers who came back, and the children who were born into the rebuilt life, and who grew up in it not knowing it as a rebuilt thing, but simply as the life their father had made, which was what it was, the life their father had made twice from the same ground with the same hands. It was enough. It was, by any measure that matters in the actual living of an actual life, more than enough.